Abigail Harper spat in the dirt at Colt Dawson's boots, and every soul on that platform gasped like she'd fired a pistol into the sky. "You want a wife who shakes when you look at her? Go dig one up from the graveyard. I ain't running, I ain't crying, and I sure as hell ain't getting back on that stage." The 5 women before her had fled screaming. Abigail Harper had just spat at his feet and dared him to send her away. Nobody in Bitterroot Gulch had ever seen anything like it. If you're watching this from your own town tonight, drop it in the comments so I know how far this story has traveled, and hit subscribe because you are not going to want to miss where this woman takes him. The stage had rattled into Bitterroot Gulch a little after noon, kicking up dust that hung in the air like it didn't want to settle either. Half the town had gathered near the trading post, same as they always did when a bride was expected. It had become a kind of sport for them. Old Ezra Tuttle leaned against the hitching post, chewing tobacco, grinning at nothing in particular. "Number 6, he said to the man beside him. "Wonder how long this one lasts. My money's on 2 days." "2 days is generous," the other man said. "Betty Grimes only lasted till supper." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Colt Dawson stood apart from them near his horse hat, pulled low, arms crossed over a chest that had been called a wall of a man more times than he cared to count. He didn't laugh. He never laughed at this part. He'd stopped believing in it, if truth be told. He'd only come today because the preacher had shamed him into it, saying it wasn't Christian to leave a woman standing alone at a stage stop, whatever might come of it after. The door of the stagecoach swung open. A boot came down first. Sturdy, practical, laced tight. Then a second boot. Then a woman filling the doorway of that coach with a presence that made the crowd's laughter catch in their throats for just a moment before it came roaring back twice as loud. She was broad. She was tall. She carried 2 suitcases that looked heavy enough to break a mule's back, and she carried them herself, one in each hand, without asking a soul for help. "Lord have mercy," someone muttered. "They're really scraping the bottom now. Bet she eats more than his whole herd." "Colt Dawson, they sent you a barn instead of a bride." The laughter came from every direction, now ugly and loud, the kind of laughter that wanted to be heard by the person it was aimed at. Children pointed. A woman in a blue bonnet covered her mouth not fast enough to hide her smile. Colt felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard this kind of laughter 5 times before, but always at himself, at his scars, at his silence, at the way he startled horses with how quiet he moved. He'd never heard it aimed at someone before him, someone who'd just stepped off a stage into a town that hadn't given her a single chance to prove herself. Abigail Harper set her suitcases down in the dirt. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She looked out over the crowd the way a rancher looks over a fence line, checking for weak posts. "You all done?" she said. Her voice carried clean across the square, no shake in it at all. The laughter faltered. "I said, are you all done?" She planted her hands on her hips. "Because I've been riding 6 days from Ohio, and I'd surely hate to interrupt your fun before you've had your fill." Nobody answered her. Ezra Tuttle stopped chewing his tobacco. "That's what I thought." She turned, scanning the crowd until her eyes landed on Colt. She studied him a long moment, the scar cutting through his eyebrow, the way his shoulders filled out his coat, the stillness in him that unsettled most people. "You'd be Colt Dawson," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am." "The one who scared off 5 women." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Reckon that's what they say." "I didn't ask what they say. I asked if it's true." The crowd had gone quiet enough now that a dog barking 2 streets over sounded like thunder. Colt looked at her, really looked the way he hadn't looked at any of the other 5. They'd all looked at the ground when they arrived. This woman looked at him like she was deciding whether he was worth her time, not the other way around. "I never scared off anybody," he said finally low. "They scared themselves, saw the mountain saw me, and decided their own imaginations were worse than anything I ever did." "Good," she said, "because I don't scare easy." He didn't know what to say to that. Nobody had ever said anything like that to him. She picked up her suitcases again before he could offer, which he'd been about to do out of pure habit. "Well," she said, "you going to stand there gawking, or are we going to get up that mountain before dark?" That was when Ezra Tuttle, never a man who knew when to leave well enough alone, called out from the crowd. "Careful, Dawson, that one there might eat you out of house and home before winter." The crowd laughed again, harder this time, some of them slapping their knees. Abigail set her suitcases down again. Slow. Deliberate. She walked straight toward Ezra Tuttle, and the crowd parted around her like water around a plow, and she stopped close enough that the old man's grin slid clean off his face. "You got a name?" she asked him. Ezra," he stammered. "Ezra." She nodded like she was filing it away. "Ezra, I've been laughed at by better men than you, in finer towns than this one, and every single one of them is still alone tonight, while I am about to go marry a man with the largest ranch in 3 counties. So you go on and laugh. I'll be up that mountain building something real, while you're still down here in the dirt, making jokes about women who never did you a single wrong." She turned on her heel and walked back to her suitcases. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Colt Dawson felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in longer than he could remember. It wasn't quite admiration. It was closer to recognition, like meeting someone who'd survived the same war he had fought on a different field, but come home with the same scars. He walked over, picked up her suitcases before she could argue, and for the first time in 5 tries, he didn't feel like he was walking a condemned woman to her own execution. "Wagons this way, ma'am," he said. "Abigail," she said. "Ma'am makes me feel like somebody's maiden aunt." "Abigail, then." They walked together toward the wagon, and the crowd watched them go, murmuring, already reshaping the story into something they'd tell at supper. Behind them, Ezra Tuttle found his voice again, quieter, now chastened. "She's got some nerve on her," he said to no one. "She's got more than nerve," said the woman in the blue bonnet, watching Abigail climb up onto the wagon seat without waiting for a hand up. That's the first one of Colt Dawson's brides that didn't look like she was walking to her own funeral. The wagon ride out of town was quiet for the first mile. Colt drove, eyes on the road, hands steady on the reins. Abigail sat beside him, back straight, taking in the country, the wide fields, the dark line of mountains rising up ahead, closer with every turn of the wheels. "You're wondering why I did that back there," she said finally. "Wasn't going to ask." "Ask anyway. Man ought to know what kind of woman he just married sight unseen." He glanced at her sideways. "All right. Why'd you do it?" "Because if I let that old fool laugh at me and said nothing, he'd have laughed at me every day I lived in that town. And I intend on living near that town a long while." She looked over at him. "I've spent my whole life letting people laugh and saying nothing, Mr. Dawson. I'm 32 years old. I don't have the years left to spend that way anymore." "It's Colt." "Colt, then." They rode on. The road narrowed, climbing, now pine crowding closer on either side. Abigail watched the country change, watched it get wilder, lonelier, more like the letters he'd sent her had described a place where a person had to be strong just to survive the winter, let alone thrive in it. "Those 5 women," she said. "What happened to them truly? Not what the town says. What actually happened." Colt was quiet a long moment, guiding the horses around a bend where the road dropped sharply on one side. First one took one look at the ranch house from a distance, saw how far it was from anything, and refused to get down off the wagon, turned right back around. And the others? Second one lasted 3 days. Said the quiet got to her. Said she couldn't sleep with nothing but wind and wolves for company. He paused. Third one saw me without my shirt on chopping wood. Saw the scars. His voice went flatter. Left the next morning while I was out checking the herd. Didn't even say goodbye. Abigail didn't flinch at that, didn't look away from him like the words might be catching. Where'd you get the scars? Grizzly. 6 years back. Near tore my arm off before I got my knife into her. He shrugged like it was nothing, though the movement pulled at something in his shoulder that told a different story. Fourth one was afraid of the work. City girl. Didn't know a hoe from a rake and didn't care to learn. Fifth one. He stopped. Fifth one, what? Fifth one said I was too quiet to love. Said a man who don't talk can't feel nothing worth feeling. He kept his eyes on the road. Packed her bag the same night and asked me to take her back to town myself. Sat next to me the whole ride and never said a word. Guess she proved her own point. Abigail let that sit a moment. That why you don't talk much, because the last one told you silence meant you were empty inside. Maybe. Well, she was wrong. Abigail folded her hands in her lap. I've known plenty of men who talk from sunup to sundown and haven't got a true feeling in the whole lot of them. Talking ain't the same as feeling, Colt Dawson. Any fool can talk. He looked at her again longer this time. You always this direct. I've learned it's faster. Life's too short for dancing around things. She turned her gaze back to the mountains. Besides, every time I've tried to be soft and quiet and small so as not to bother anybody with my opinions, it never once made a man love me. Only made him forget I was in the room. I doubt anybody forgets you're in the room, Colt said before he'd thought better of it. The corner of her mouth twitched almost a smile. That a compliment, Mr. Dawson? Might be. Well, don't strain yourself. They rode on in something that wasn't quite comfortable silence, but wasn't hostile either. Something new that neither of them had a name for yet. The ranch house came into view as the sun dropped lower. A sturdy structure of hewn logs set against a backdrop of dark pine and rising granite smoke, curling faint from the chimney, where the housekeeper, an older Cheyenne woman named Little Feather, who came twice a week to help with what Colt couldn't manage alone, had left a fire banked for his return. Barns and corrals spread out beyond it, fences running for what looked like miles, cattle scattered dark against the green of the high pasture. Abigail sat forward, taking it in. It's a great deal of land, she said. More than I can rightly manage alone. That's the truth of it, if you want it plain. I don't need a wife for company, Miss Harper. I need one who can work, because this place is too much for one man, and I'm too proud to hire on more hands than I can afford to pay honest wages. He pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. Figured you ought to know that before you unpack. I figured that the moment I read your first letter. Abigail climbed down from the wagon before he could offer a hand, same as she had at the stage stop. You wrote 3 pages about fence repair and half a page about yourself. A woman can read between those lines, Mr. Dawson. And you came anyway. I came because I've spent my whole life being told I was too much woman for gentle work and not enough woman for anything else. You're the first man who ever wrote to me and talked about needing hands, not needing a wife to look pretty on his arm at church. She hefted her suitcases again. I've got hands. I intend to use them. He watched her walk toward the house unassisted, unbothered by the climb up the porch steps, unbothered by the size of the place, or the silence pressing in around it, the way it had pressed in and driven off 5 women before her. Something in his chest, long closed up, creaked open half an inch. That first night, she wouldn't let him carry her bags up the stairs. I've been carrying my own weight my whole life, she told him, hauling both suitcases up herself while he stood at the bottom of the staircase, feeling useless in his own house. I don't intend to stop now on account of a wedding ring I haven't even got yet. We're not married yet, he said. Preacher can't come up till Sunday. I'm aware. She reached the top of the stairs, looked back down at him. Which room's mine? End of the hall. I had Little Feather make it up proper when your letter came saying you'd accepted. Proper meaning? Meaning she put fresh linens on and swept it out good. It ain't fancy. Ain't much is out here. Fancy never did anybody's supper any good, Abigail said, and disappeared down the hall. He stood at the bottom of the stairs a long moment, listening to her move around up there, opening and shutting drawers, the small, ordinary sounds of a woman settling into a house that had gone 5 brides deep in disappointment. He found himself hoping in a way he hadn't let himself hope in a long while, that this time might be different. He was setting a pot of beans to warm over the fire when she came back down, having changed from her traveling clothes into something plainer, sleeves already rolled to the elbow, like she meant business. What's the plan for supper? She asked. Was going to be beans and salt pork. Ain't much of a cook if I'm honest. Little Feather leaves what she can twice a week, but the rest of the time I fend for myself. Abigail looked into the pot, wrinkled her nose slightly, then rolled up her other sleeve. Move aside. You don't have to, Colt Dawson. She said his name like a warning shot. I have been cooking for other people's tables since I was 9 years old, back when my mother took in washing and sewing to keep us fed after my father died, and I learned early that a woman who can feed a house well is a woman nobody can easily turn out. Now, move aside and show me where you keep your flour, unless you'd like to eat plain beans for the rest of your natural life. He moved aside. She worked fast, capable finding her way around a kitchen that wasn't hers yet, like she'd been born to it. Biscuits going together from memory. Salt pork sizzling in the skillet, gravy thickening under her hand while she talked, filling the silence of that house in a way it hadn't been filled in years. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, not looking up from the skillet. "The real shape of it. Not what you wrote in the letters trying to sound respectable." "It's hard," he said. "Harder than most folks in town understand. Winters up here, the snow comes early and stays late. We lose stock some years to wolves, some years to cold, some years to nothing but bad luck. I've buried more cattle than I like to count, and there's seasons I've near gone under myself, financially speaking. But you've held on. Held on because I didn't have any other choice that felt like living. My pa died when I was 19, left me this land, and more debt than land was worth. Took me 12 years to clear it and build something that actually turns a profit most seasons. I'm not about to let it go now." "No," Abigail agreed. "I don't imagine you are." She set a plate in front of him. Biscuits, golden gravy, thick salt pork, crisp at the edges. Better food than that kitchen had produced in longer than he cared to admit. He ate in silence for a while, and she let him occupying herself with her own plate until he finally set his fork down and looked at her with something like wonder. "This is the best meal I've had in this house since my mother passed," he said. Abigail's expression shifted, something softening in her eyes that hadn't been there in the yard when she'd faced down the whole town. "Well, somebody ought to feed you proper. Man can't run a ranch on beans and regret." "Regret," he repeated. "That's what I smelled the moment I walked in this house. Regret and dust, and a man who's been alone so long he's forgotten what it sounds like to have someone answer him back." She looked at him steady. "I aim to change that, Colt Dawson. Not because I pity you. Because I think you and I might understand each other better than most folks would guess looking at the two of us." He didn't answer right away. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, and somewhere far off a wolf called, and another answered, the mountain settling into its nightly conversation with itself. "What do you mean?" he said finally. "Understand each other." Abigail set down her own fork. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stage, something like vulnerability crossed her face, quick there and gone. "I mean, I know what it is to walk into a room and watch people decide who you are before you've said a single word. I know what it is to be looked at and measured and found wanting, not for anything you did, but for the space you take up in the world." She held his gaze. "I'd wager you know something of that too. Man your size, scars like that. Folks look at you and decide you're dangerous before you've done a thing to earn it." Colt was quiet a long moment. "5 women decided that," he said. "Decided it fast, too." "5 women were foolish," Abigail said. "I don't intend to make their mistake." He studied her across the table, the lamplight catching the strength in her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes that hadn't wavered once since she'd stepped off that stagecoach into a town that had done everything in its power to break her before she'd even started. "Why'd you really come out here?" he asked. "Real reason. Not the one you gave Ezra Tuttle in the street." Abigail was quiet a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "Because I was tired," she said finally. "Tired of shrinking myself down to fit into rooms that were never built for me in the first place. Tired of men who wanted me to apologize for my own body before they'd even consider loving what was inside it. I read your letter, the plain, clumsy honesty of it, and I thought, here is a man who isn't asking me to be smaller. He's asking me to be strong. And I have spent my whole life being told strength wasn't ladylike, wasn't attractive, wasn't wanted." Her voice caught just slightly before she steadied it. "I wanted for once to go somewhere. My strength would be the thing that was wanted." The fire popped in the hearth. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. "It's wanted here," Colt said finally, low and rough. God knows this land doesn't care what a person looks like, only cares whether they can hold on when the winter comes. Then I reckon I've come to the right place. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the room at the end of the hall, listening to the wind work against the shutters and the unfamiliar sounds of a house that wasn't yet home, Abigail Harper allowed herself for the first time in longer than she could remember to imagine that a man might look at her and see something other than a problem to be solved or a joke to be made. Down the hall in his own room, Colt Dawson lay awake listening to the quiet and understood with a certainty that unsettled him more than any grizzly ever had, that he had just let a stranger walk into his house and rearrange something in his chest that he'd thought was permanently shut. The next morning came early, the way mornings always came, on a mountain ranch. Gray light barely touching the ridgeline when Colt rose to start the chores. He expected, as he always did, to work alone until Little Feather's next visit. He found Abigail already in the kitchen, apron-tied, coffee brewing, sleeves rolled. "Didn't figure you'd be up," he said. "I was raised on a farm before my father died," she said. "Sun comes up, work starts. That's how it's always been for me." She handed him a cup of coffee, strong and black, exactly how he liked it, though she'd had no way of knowing that. "What needs doing today?" "Fence lines down along the north pasture. Cattle keep drifting through the gap. Was going to spend the morning mending it." "I'll come with you." "It's hard work. Not fit for—" "Finish that sentence. Careful, Colt Dawson." Her eyes narrowed, but there was humor under the warning, not just fire. "I have hauled water-split wood and birthed calves on my uncle's farm since I was 12 years old. I am not a china doll you need to keep on a shelf." He looked at her a long moment, weighing the offer, weighing everything he thought he knew about how a wife was supposed to spend her mornings. Then he thought of the 5 women before her, none of whom had ever offered to do a single day's ranch work, all of whom had fled before they'd even tried. "All right," he said. "Grab some gloves. There's an extra pair by the door." They worked the fence line together through the morning, Colt sinking posts while Abigail strung wire. Her hands sure and practiced in a way that surprised him more with every passing hour. She didn't complain about the sun, didn't complain about the ache that had to be building in muscles unused to this particular labor, didn't once ask to stop and rest before he did. "You've done this before," he said, watching her twist wire taut around a post with practiced efficiency. "Told you, farm work before my father died. After that my mother took in sewing and I helped where I could, but I never forgot how to use my hands for something other than a needle." She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. Some folks think a big woman's only good for one kind of work in a kitchen, or nowhere at all. They forget that strength is strength wherever it's found. "I never thought that," Colt said. "Never had cause to. Strength's strength on a ranch. Don't much matter what shape it comes in, so long as the fence gets built and the cattle stay put." Abigail looked at him, something shifting behind her eyes. "You mean that?" "Wouldn't say it otherwise. Never was much good at saying things I didn't mean." They worked in a companionable rhythm after that, exchanging fewer words, but somehow understanding each other better, with every post sunk, every length of wire drawn taut. By midday, the fence line stood mended straighter and sturdier than it had been in months, and Colt found himself looking at the work they'd done together with a satisfaction he hadn't felt in longer than he could name. "You're better at this than most hired hands I've had," he admitted as they walked back toward the house for the midday meal. "I intend to earn my place here," Abigail said, "not be given it out of pity, and not have it questioned every time somebody in town decides to laugh at the size of me. I want it because I built it same as you built this ranch." "Nobody's questioning it," Colt said. "Not out here. Give it time." Abigail said, a note of old weariness in her voice. "Somebody always does eventually." She was not wrong, though neither of them knew yet how soon that test would come, nor how much it would cost them both before the mountain was through testing what they'd started to build together. That afternoon, as Colt rode out to check on a section of herd grazing near the tree line, a rider approached from the direction of town. Hank Dooley, one of the few neighboring ranchers close enough to visit regular, a man Colt had known most of his life, and trusted about as much as he trusted anyone outside his own 4 walls. Heard you got yourself bride number 6, Hank said, reining up alongside him, a smirk already forming. Word travels fast. Whole town's talking about it, about how she spat at Ezra Tuttle's boots and told the whole crowd off. Hank shook his head, though there was something like respect buried under his amusement. Never seen anybody put Ezra in his place like that. Man's been running his mouth since before either of us were born. She's got sand, Colt said. More than most. That's so. Hank's eyes narrowed slightly, studying his friend's face. You sound different, Colt. Been a long while since I heard you talk about a woman like that. Colt didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting toward the ranch house, small in the distance, smoke rising steady from the chimney, where Abigail was likely already starting the evening meal. She's different, he said finally. Don't rightly know how to explain it more than that. Well. Hank straightened in his saddle. Town's placing bets on how long she lasts. Same as they did the other 5. Wanted you to know so you're not caught off guard by the talk. Let them bet. Colt said, something hardening in his voice that hadn't been there in longer than Hank could recall. She ain't going anywhere. And anybody who says different to my face is going to find out just how wrong they are. Hank studied him a long moment, then nodded slow, as if confirming something to himself. Never thought I'd see the day. He muttered half to himself before turning his horse back toward town, leaving Colt alone on the ridge with the wind and the wide sky, and a feeling in his chest that he was only just beginning to understand. By the time he rode back down to the house that evening, the smell of supper cooking drifted out to meet him. Something rich and warm, biscuits and stew. The kind of smell that made a house feel occupied in a way his hadn't felt in years. Abigail met him on the porch, apron still tied hair coming loose from its pins, in a way that softened the fierce set of her jaw from earlier that day. Supper's near ready, she said. Wash up. You smell like a horse. I've been told worse. I imagine you have. She turned back toward the door, then paused, looking back at him. Somebody came by while you were out, rode up, saw me on the porch, and turned right back around without a word. Colt's jaw tightened. Who? Didn't get a name. Older man, thin as a fence post, looked at me like I was something he'd stepped in. She said it plainly, without the sting of hurt he might have expected, though he could see it there underneath, carefully controlled. Reckon he'd heard about the new bride and wanted to see for himself whether the stories were true. I'll find out who it was. Don't trouble yourself. Abigail's chin lifted that same fire from the stage stop kindling behind her eyes. Let them come look. Let them see for themselves that I am not going anywhere. I've been stared at by better men than whoever that was. Colt Dawson and I have outlasted every single one of their opinions of me. He looked at her a long moment, standing there in his doorway, apron dusted with flour, chin high, utterly unbroken by a town that had done everything short of running her out on a rail. They don't know what they're dealing with, he said quietly. No. Abigail agreed, a small fierce smile touching her mouth. They surely don't. That night after supper, after the dishes were cleared and the fire banked low, they sat together on the porch a while, watching the last light drain out of the western sky, painting the peaks gold and then gray and then dark. Tomorrow, I ought to show you the rest of the place proper, Colt said. The barns, the far pastures where the creek runs. You ought to know the whole of it if you mean to stay. I mean to stay, Abigail said without hesitation, without a trace of the doubt that had driven 5 women before her back down that mountain within days. Even after today, even with folks in town already placing bets against you, Abigail turned to look at him, the last of the light catching the steadiness in her eyes. Colt Dawson, I have spent 32 years having people bet against me. I have never once let their wagers decide the shape of my life. I do not intend to start now on a mountain with a man who has finally, for the first time in his letters and in his words tonight, made me believe that maybe I have found somewhere I am allowed to simply be exactly as large and strong and unashamed as I actually am. Colt didn't answer with words. He simply nodded once, a gesture that carried more weight in its silence than most men's whole speeches, and together they sat on the porch as full dark settled over the mountain. Two people who had both spent their lives being underestimated, beginning cautiously to understand that they might have found in each other exactly what neither had dared to hope still existed in this world. Neither of them spoke of the preacher coming Sunday, though both were thinking of it. Neither of them spoke of the 5 women who had come before, though the ghost of their failures hung faintly in the walls of that house, waiting to be proven wrong. Sunday came faster than either of them expected. The preacher, a stooped, kindly man named Reverend Pruitt, who had married half the county over the past 20 years, rode up the mountain trail with his Bible tucked under one arm, and an expression that suggested he'd heard every rumor circulating through Bitterroot Gulch and had formed his own private opinions about the truth of them. He was not alone. Behind him rode a small procession of townsfolk, Ezra Tuttle among them, along with the woman in the blue bonnet whose name Abigail had since learned was Mrs. Colleen Whitfield, and a handful of others who had apparently decided that watching bride number 6 either succeed or fail at the altar was too good an entertainment to miss. "Didn't expect an audience," Colt muttered, standing on the porch beside Abigail, as the small crowd dismounted in the yard. "Folks rarely miss a chance to watch somebody they've already judged," Abigail said, smoothing the front of the plain gray dress she'd chosen for the occasion. Nothing fancy, nothing borrowed from a life she'd never had, just clean and pressed and entirely her own. "Let them watch." Reverend Pruitt climbed the porch steps, extending a hand first to Colt, then with only the barest hesitation to Abigail. "Miss Harper, I understand you've had quite an arrival in our town." "I've had quite a life, Reverend. Bitterroot Gulch was only the latest chapter." Something flickered in the old preacher's eyes. Amusement, perhaps, or respect, or both. "Well said. Shall we begin then, or would you prefer to wait for more of the town to arrive and gawk?" "I'd prefer to get on with it," Abigail said. "I didn't come up this mountain to wait on anybody's convenience but my own." The ceremony was brief, conducted in the yard beneath a sky scrubbed clean by the previous night's wind. Colt and Abigail standing before the small gathered crowd, while the Reverend spoke the familiar words that had bound together every couple in 3 counties for 2 decades running. Ezra Tuttle, to his credit, kept his mouth shut throughout, though his eyes never quite lost their skeptical squint. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed at her face with a handkerchief. Whether from genuine sentiment or simple habit at weddings, nobody could say for certain. When the Reverend pronounced them married, Colt turned to Abigail. Uncertain the way a man is uncertain about a thing he has failed at 5 times previous, and dares not hope will succeed on the 6th attempt. "Well?" Abigail said low enough that only he could hear. "Go on and kiss your wife, Colt Dawson, unless you'd like to give this crowd something else entirely to gossip about." He kissed her. It was not the kiss of 2 strangers performing an obligation. There was something searching in it, something that surprised them both, and when they broke apart, Colt's ears had gone red in a way Abigail found she rather liked. The small crowd applauded some more enthusiastically than others, and Reverend Pruitt closed his Bible with a satisfied nod. "I've married a great many couples on this mountain," he said mostly to himself, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Something tells me this one might actually last." "You doubted the others?" Colt asked, an edge in his voice. "I doubted the town's ability to let any of them succeed," Pruitt said, glancing meaningfully toward Ezra Tuttle, who had the grace to look briefly ashamed. "A woman can only build a home in peace if the folks around her allow her the chance to try. I pray for both your sakes that this town has finally learned that lesson." The crowd lingered only a short while longer, accepting the modest refreshments Abigail had prepared the evening before mounting up and heading back down the mountain trail toward town, leaving Colt and Abigail alone in the settling quiet of late afternoon. "Well," Abigail said, watching the dust of their departure, "that's done." "That's done," Colt agreed. "Feel any different?" He considered the question seriously, the way he considered most things. "Feel like maybe this house has got a chance now. Feels different than it did 5 times before." "Good," Abigail said, "because I intend to make certain it stays that way." The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had quite anticipated. Hard, honest physical work from sunup to sundown, punctuated by meals Abigail insisted on making properly, and evenings spent on the porch, watching the mountain change colors as the season inched toward autumn. Abigail proved day after day that she had not exaggerated a single word of her own capability. She reorganized the root cellar, doubling its storage efficiency through methods she'd learned helping her mother stretch every scrap through lean winters. She took over the chickens entirely, and within 2 weeks had them laying more consistently than they had in years, simply through closer attention and better feed rationing. She mended, cooked, hauled, chopped, and worked alongside Colt on fence lines and cattle drives with an endurance that impressed even the most skeptical of his memories regarding what a wife was supposed to be capable of. But it was not only her competence that began to change something in that house. It was the way she talked to him, direct, unflinching, never once softening a truth simply to spare his feelings, but never once cruel about it either. One evening, mending a torn shirt by lamplight while Colt oiled a saddle nearby, she looked up at him with the particular directness that had become familiar to him. Now no longer unsettling, but almost comforting in its consistency. "You don't talk much about your mother," she said. Colt's hands stilled on the leather. "Not much to tell. She died when I was 17. Fever took her quick over a single bad week. My pa never rightly recovered from it. Followed her 2 years later, though the doctor called it his heart giving out. I always figured it was more like his heart just stopped wanting to keep beating without her. That why you built this ranch the way you did big enough that loneliness can't catch you." Colt looked at her a long moment, surprised as he so often was lately, by how precisely she saw straight through to the center of him. "Never thought of it that way. But maybe." "It didn't work though, did it?" Abigail said gently. "Building it bigger. The loneliness caught you anyway." "Reckon it did." He set the saddle aside, met her eyes fully. "Until now. My father died when I was 9. Abigail said after a while, offering the confidence freely, the way she'd learned he never asked for what he wasn't given. "Farm accident. After that it was just my mother and me, and she took in washing and sewing to keep us fed, worked her hands raw doing it. I grew up watching a strong woman refuse to break no matter how hard the world pushed on her. I suppose I learned my stubbornness from her." "She sounds like she'd have liked you here," Colt said. "Doing what you're doing. She'd have loved it," Abigail said, a rare softness in her voice. She always said a woman's worth wasn't measured by how small she made herself for other people's comfort. Said it was measured by how much she could carry and how far she could carry it, and whether she kept walking even when the load got heavy. She looked at him. "I've carried a great deal in my life, Colt Dawson. I intend to carry a great deal more here if you'll let me." "Ain't a question of letting," Colt said. "This is your home now, same as it's mine. You carry whatever you're able, and I'll carry what I'm able, and between the two of us, I reckon we'll manage more than either of us could alone." Not every day passed so gently, however. Nearly 3 weeks into their marriage, trouble arrived at the ranch in the form of a man neither of them had met before, a cattle buyer from the county seat named Wendell Cross, come to negotiate terms on Colt's autumn herd, and a man who had clearly heard every unkind rumor circulating about the 6th Dawson bride before he'd ever set foot on the property. He arrived at midday while Abigail was in the yard, hanging washing. Her sleeves rolled, her hair pinned back, plain and practical sweat beating at her temple from the day's heat. Cross reined up his horse, looked her over with an expression that made Colt's jaw tighten, even from a distance, and said loud enough to carry clear across the yard, "This the famous bride I've been hearing about, the one Ezra Tuttle says eats more than the whole herd combined." Colt started forward, fury already building in his chest, but Abigail held up a hand without even turning fully to face the man, silencing her husband's approach with a single gesture. "I am," she said, setting down her basket of washing with deliberate calm. "And you'd be Wendell Cross. Hear about the cattle." "Well, Mr. Cross?" Abigail wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him with the same unhurried confidence she'd shown Ezra Tuttle on the day of her arrival. "I'll tell you what I told the last man who thought my size was any of his business. I have hauled water for this ranch, mended fences, doubled the yield of that root cellar, and I currently have bread rising in that kitchen that will outlast every unkind word you've got left in you. Now, are you here to talk cattle with my husband, or are you here to insult his wife on his own land? Because I promise you only one of those activities is going to end pleasantly for you today." Cross's face went through several colors in quick succession, landing finally on a deep, uncomfortable red. Colt, watching from the porch, found himself fighting down a laugh he hadn't expected, pride swelling hot and unfamiliar in his chest. "I didn't mean any offense, ma'am," Cross stammered. "Course you didn't," Abigail said, sweetness in her voice, now, though there was steel underneath it that left no doubt as to her sincerity. "Nobody ever does until somebody makes them account for it. Go on and talk your business with Colt. I've got bread to see to." She turned, picked her basket back up, and walked into the house without another glance in his direction, leaving Wendell Cross to dismount in considerably chastened silence and conduct his cattle business with a man who watched him with new and careful scrutiny for the remainder of the visit. That night, after Cross had ridden off with his deal struck and his tail figuratively between his legs, Colt found Abigail in the kitchen, and for a long moment simply watched her work before she noticed him standing there. "You didn't have to defend yourself alone," he said finally. "I'd have said something." "I know you would have," Abigail said, not looking up from the dough she was kneading. "But I've learned over 32 years that a woman who waits for a man to defend her every single time somebody insults her never learns to defend herself at all. And I intend to make sure I never forget how." "Still," Colt said, moving closer, something urgent in his voice now. "You're not alone anymore, Abigail. Whatever comes at you, comes at both of us now. I need you to understand that." She looked up at him, then flour dusting her hands, something vulnerable flickering behind the steadiness in her eyes. "That's a large thing to promise, Colt Dawson. 5 women before me heard promises too, I'd wager, before they ever set foot on this land. I never promised any of them what I'm promising you," Colt said, and there was a rawness in his voice that hadn't been there before, an honesty stripped bare of his usual careful reserve. "I never once in 5 tries felt what I feel watching you stand up to a man twice as loud as you in my own yard without once looking back to see if I was coming to save you. I don't want to save you, Abigail. I want to stand beside you. There's a difference, and I only just this month learned what it was." "That," Abigail said softly, "is the finest thing anybody has ever said to me." "It's the truest thing I've ever said to anybody," Colt replied. She crossed the small distance between them, flour-dusted hands and all, and this time when they kissed, there was no crowd watching, no reverend waiting, no town placing bets on how long it would last. There was only the two of them in a kitchen that had finally, after so many failed attempts, begun to feel like the home it was always meant to be. Later that same week, the mountain gave them a taste of what autumn would soon demand. Colt woke before dawn to the frantic bawling of cattle and the unmistakable bone-deep howl of a wolf too close to the herd. He was up and dressed and reaching for his rifle before Abigail had even fully opened her eyes. "What is it?" she asked, already throwing back the quilt. "Wolves, near the north pasture. Stay here." "Like hell I will." She was pulling on her boots before he'd finished the sentence. "You think I came up this mountain to hide indoors every time trouble howls? Abigail, this isn't fence mending. This is a rifle and a pack of wolves in the dark." "Then you'd best hope I shoot straighter than I sow," she said, already moving past him toward the door. "Because I'm coming, and arguing about it is wasting time we don't have." There was no time to argue further. They rode out together into the gray half-light, the herd's panic growing louder as they approached dark shapes moving low and fast at the tree line. Colt fired once into the air to scatter them, and 2 wolves broke from the shadows near a cow separated from the herd, its calf bawling in terror beside it. "Get the calf!" Colt shouted, already moving to cut off the larger wolf's approach to the mother cow. Abigail didn't hesitate. She spurred her horse forward, placing herself between the smaller wolf and the terrified calf, shouting and waving her arms with a fearlessness that sent the animal veering off into the brush. Colt's rifle cracked again, and the second wolf yelped and retreated, the pack melting back into the tree line as quickly as it had appeared. Silence settled over the pasture, broken only by the herd's slowly calming breath and the pounding of both their hearts. "You could have been killed," Colt said, riding up beside her, his voice rough with an emotion that hadn't fully settled yet from fear into relief. "So could you," Abigail said, though her hands were trembling now that the danger had passed, the calf pressed safely against its mother a few yards off. We came out here together. Seemed only right we'd face it together, too. Colt looked at her for a long moment in the strengthening dawn light, something fierce and grateful and entirely unguarded moving across his features. 5 women ran from far less than a howl in the dark, he said quietly. You rode straight at it. I told you the first day, Abigail said, steadying her breath, steadying her voice. I don't scare easy, and I don't intend to let anything on this mountain wolf or man decide that I'm not strong enough to stand beside my own husband when it matters. They rode back toward the house as the sun broke fully over the ridgeline, gilding the frost-tipped grass gold, the herd settling behind them safe for one more morning. Neither of them spoke of how close it had come. Neither of them needed to. Something had shifted between them out there in the dark, some final measure of doubt burned away by the simple, undeniable fact that when trouble came, Abigail Harper had not run. She had ridden straight toward it, same as him. And as they unsaddled their horses in the pale morning light, Colt reached out and took her hand, still faintly trembling from the ride, and held it steady in his own. I used to think I'd spend my whole life on this mountain alone, he said. Used to think that was just the shape my life was always going to take. And now? Abigail asked. Now I think maybe I was just waiting, Colt said. For somebody strong enough to stand here with me. Abigail said nothing in reply. She simply tightened her hand around his, and together they walked back toward the house, as the last of the wolves' howling faded into the waking mountain morning. 2 people who had both been underestimated their whole lives, standing now exactly where they had decided together that they belonged. Little Feather arrived 2 days later, riding in on her sturdy bay mare with a basket of dried herbs balanced against her hip, and stopped cold in the yard at the sight of Abigail up on a ladder, restringing a section of the porch roof that had come loose in the wolf night wind. You'll break your neck, Little Feather said by way of greeting. I've broken worse things than a neck and lived to tell it. Abigail called down, not pausing in her work. You must be the woman who keeps this house from falling down around Colt's ears. Somebody has to. Little Feather set her basket down, studying the newest Dawson bride with the frank, unhurried appraisal of a woman who had watched 5 others come and go, and had learned not to waste her opinions until they were earned. You're still here. I am. The others weren't by this many days. I noticed. Abigail climbed down the ladder, wiping her palms on her apron, meeting the older woman's eyes without flinching. I don't intend to be counted among them. Little Feather studied her a moment longer. Then something in her face eased the barest suggestion of approval. Cellar's a mess. Nobody's turned the root vegetables proper since the spring thaw. If you mean to feed this house through winter, that's where I'd start. Show me. They descended together into the dim earthen cool of the cellar, and what Abigail found there made her breath catch sacks of potatoes gone soft with rot in the corners, jars of preserves crusted with mold along the shelves nearest the damp wall, a season's worth of careless neglect that could mean the difference between a full table in February and a hungry one. This won't do, Abigail said, already sorting, already calculating. This won't do at all. We've got maybe 6 weeks before first snow if the almanac Colt showed me is worth trusting, and half of what's down here is already lost. I told him last spring it needed doing, Little Feather said. Man's got 2 hands and not enough hours to use them both. Ranch work don't leave room for cellar work, not when you're managing it alone. Well, he's not managing it alone anymore. Abigail rolled her sleeves higher. Help me carry the spoiled sacks up. We'll burn what's ruined, and I'll get to work on what's savable before supper. They worked through the afternoon, hauling, sorting, scrubbing shelves down with vinegar water, and by the time Colt came in from the north pasture, filthy and tired, he found both women elbow-deep in cellar work, laughing over something Little Feather had said about the last bride who'd fainted at the sight of a mouse nest. Didn't expect a party down here, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Wasn't a party when we started. Abigail said, not looking up from the jar she was labeling. Your cellar was a disgrace, Colt Dawson. Half your winter stores were rotting while you were out chasing cattle. Nobody ever told me that plain. I'm telling you plain now. She straightened, hands on her hips, streak of dirt across one cheek. It's fixed, mostly. We'll need more jars from town before the harvest comes in fully, And I want to talk to you tonight about what we plant different next spring, because half your garden's wasted on crops that don't keep." Little Feather caught Colt's eye over Abigail's shoulder and gave him a look that needed no words to translate approval, plain and simple, the kind she hadn't given any of the five before. That night, over a supper of stewed rabbit and the last of the good bread, Abigail laid out her plans with the same directness she brought to everything, sketching rough notes on the back of an old feed ledger, while Colt listened, nodding occasionally, objecting only to be talked around by an argument he couldn't fault. "You've thought about this a great deal," he said, watching her work. "I've thought about hunger a great deal," Abigail said, quieter than usual. "There were winters after my father died when my mother and I ate turnips 3 meals a day, because that was all the root cellar held. I don't intend to live that way again, not if I've got hands and time enough to prevent it." "We won't go hungry here," Colt said, "not with you managing things." "No," Abigail agreed, a small, fierce satisfaction in her voice. "We won't." The next morning brought a trip into Bitterroot Gulch for supplies, and Abigail insisted on coming along despite Colt's quiet suggestion that she might prefer to stay behind after the reception she'd received on her first visit. "I'm not hiding from that town," she said, climbing up onto the wagon seat before he could argue further. "Hiding only teaches folks that their laughter worked." The town looked different in daylight. Ordinary and dusty wagons and horses tied along the main street, women in bonnets moving between the general store and the millinery men gathered outside the saloon in the loose, unhurried way of a slow Tuesday morning. Word of the wedding had clearly spread because heads turned as their wagon rolled in conversations. Pausing, though this time, the whispers carried a different note than before. Less mockery, now more uncertain curiosity, as if the town hadn't yet decided what to make of a bride who refused to run. Inside the general store, the owner, a stout, balding man named Mr. Higgins, greeted them with careful politeness, clearly having heard every version of the stage stop incident secondhand and unsure which version to believe. "Mrs. Dawson," he said, testing the name. "Pleasure to have you in my store. Mr. Higgins?" Abigail nodded, already moving down the aisle toward the canning jars, mind clearly still occupied with cellar arithmetic. "I'll need 8 dozen jars if you've got them, wide mouth for preserves, and whatever spices you've got that keep well, cinnamon cloves if you carry them." "That's a considerable order. I intend to fill every one of them before the snow flies," Abigail said, already counting jars into a crate. "A ranch this size ought to be feeding itself through winter, not scraping by on beans and prayer." Higgins glanced toward Colt, an unspoken question in his eyes. "She's right," Colt said simply. "Give her whatever she asks for. Bill it to my account." It was while Abigail was deep in negotiation over the price of cloves that the trouble started arriving in the shape of a woman Abigail hadn't yet met. Younger, fashionably dressed for a mountain town, with the particular sharp prettiness of someone who had never once been laughed at for the shape of her own body. "So this is her," the woman said to no one in particular, loud enough to carry across the store. "The 6th one." Abigail turned unhurried already, recognizing the tone from long practice. "I am. And you'd be Loretta Sims." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I was engaged to Colt Dawson once, you know, before he built that ranch up so big it swallowed him whole. Broke it off myself before you ask, couldn't stomach the idea of a life that lonely." The store had gone quiet, the way it always seemed to go quiet whenever anyone tried to needle Abigail Harper in public. "That's so," Abigail said. "Well, Miss Sims, I don't know what kind of life you were picturing, but I've found the mountain suits me a great deal better than I expected. Might be it wasn't loneliness that scared you off. Might be it was the work. Some women aren't built for hard living, and there's no shame in knowing your own limits." "Are you calling me weak?" "I'm saying every woman's got her own measure of what she can carry," Abigail said, turning back to her jars with deliberate calm. "Yours turned out lighter than mine. That's not an insult, Miss Sims. That's just arithmetic." A ripple of poorly hidden laughter moved through the small crowd that had gathered, and Loretta Sims's face went tight with fury before she spun on her heel and stormed out of the store, the bell over the door jangling hard behind her. Colt, who had watched the entire exchange without moving, without needing to move, found Higgins staring at him with something like awe. "Never seen anybody put Loretta Sims in her place like that," Higgins said. "Woman's had half this town scared of her sharp tongue since she was 16 years old." "She hasn't met my wife's tongue," Colt said, and for the first time in longer than anyone in that store could remember. Colt Dawson smiled a real smile, easy and unguarded, watching Abigail continue calmly counting jars, as if nothing at all had happened. They loaded the wagon and were preparing to head back up the mountain when a new figure approached, older, silver-haired, dressed sharper than most men in that town, in a black frock coat that spoke of banking rather than ranching a gold watch chain visible at his vest. "Mr. Dawson." The man's voice was smooth, practiced the kind of voice that had delivered bad news to 100 ranchers before and learned to make it sound almost reasonable. "A moment of your time, if you'd be so kind." Colt's easy smile faded instantly. "Mr. Ashworth." "I won't keep you long." Ashworth's eyes flicked briefly to Abigail, cataloging her before returning to Colt. "I wanted to extend my congratulations on your marriage, and to remind you in the spirit of neighborly courtesy that your father's note comes due for review this coming spring. I do hope the ranch is prospering well enough to meet its obligations." "The ranch is fine, Ashworth. I'm sure it is." Ashworth's smile didn't waver, but something cold moved behind his eyes. "Do give my regards to your bride. I understand she's already proven herself quite formidable." He tipped his hat and walked away without waiting for a reply, leaving a silence behind him that felt entirely different from the silences Abigail had grown used to that day. "Who was that?" Abigail said once he was out of earshot, "and why does my stomach say I ought not trust him?" "Silas Ashworth. Runs the bank here and half the loans in 3 counties besides." Colt's jaw had gone tight, the easy warmth from moments before entirely drained out of him. "He holds the note my father took out to buy the last parcel of land, the one that runs along the creek. I've been paying it down steady for years, but it's never quite cleared." "How much is left on it?" "Enough," Colt said, climbing up onto the wagon seat, not quite meeting her eyes. "Enough that a bad season could put us behind on it, and a man like Ashworth doesn't forgive a note that falls behind. He collects, one way or another." Abigail sat with that a long moment as the wagon rolled out of town, the mountains rising dark and familiar ahead of them. "You didn't mention this before?" "Didn't seem like something to trouble a new bride with before she'd even unpacked her bags." "Colt Dawson." Abigail turned to face him fully, something sharp and urgent in her voice now. "I told you the first night in that kitchen whatever comes at you comes at both of us now. That includes bankers in fancy coats with cold eyes and gold watch chains. I need to know what we're facing, not be protected from it like I'm made of glass." Colt was quiet a long moment, guiding the horses around a familiar bend. "All right," he said finally. "You're right. I should have told you plain. Tell me now then, all of it." He told her the whole story, unfolding slow across the miles back up the mountain, his father's overreach in the last years before his death. Borrowing against land he'd hoped would double their herd's grazing range. The debt that had outlived him and settled onto Colt's shoulders at 19 years old, alongside a grief he'd barely had time to feel before the work of survival swallowed it whole. 12 years of steady payments, careful seasons, a herd built slow and honest, and still, the note hung over the ranch like a debt that refused to ever quite close. "How much time before spring review?" Abigail asked when he'd finished. 6 months, give or take." "And if we can't pay it in full?" Colt's silence answered before his words did. "Then Ashworth's got legal right to call the whole note due, and if I can't produce it, he takes the parcel along the creek, which happens to be the best grazing land on this whole ranch and the water source for near everything else besides. So he loses nothing and gains the one piece of land that would cripple the rest." Abigail said slowly, her mind already working the way it worked over cellar inventories and fence lines, turning the problem over, searching for its weakest point. "That's not accident, Colt. That's design. A man like that doesn't structure a loan careless." "No," Colt admitted. "He doesn't. Then we'd best get to work proving him wrong." Abigail said, chin-lifting with the same fire she'd shown Ezra Tuttle at the stage stop, the same fire she'd shown Wendell Cross in the yard, the same fire that had ridden straight at a pack of wolves in the dark without a moment's hesitation. "Because I did not come up this mountain to watch a man in a fancy coat take what you and your father spent your whole lives building." That evening, and many evenings after, the kitchen table became something new, not just a place for supper, but a place for planning ledgers spread open between them. Abigail's quick arithmetic catching errors and inefficiencies that had gone unnoticed for years in Colt's careful but exhausted bookkeeping. "You've been underselling your cattle," she said one night, running her finger down a column of figures. "Cross paid you $11 a head last month. I heard talk in town that the Hendersons got 13 for stock, no better than yours." "Cross has always paid 11. Never thought to question it." "Question it," Abigail said firmly. "Every dollar matters now. We can't afford to leave money sitting in another man's pocket out of habit." She was right again and again in ways that both humbled and heartened him. Right about the cattle prices. Right about stretching the harvest further through better preservation. Right about 100 small economies that added together began to look like the beginnings of a real defense against Ashworth's looming deadline. But the debt was large, and the mountain, as if sensing the pressure building in that house, seemed determined to make the path harder still. The first real test came on a gray afternoon in early September, when Colt rode out alone to check a section of fence near the ridge and didn't return by dark. Abigail waited on the porch as the light failed completely, watching the tree line, with a growing knot of dread tightening in her chest, until finally, unable to bear the waiting any longer, she saddled her own horse and rode out into the deepening dark lantern, swinging from the saddle horn, calling his name into the wind. She found him a mile out on foot, leading his limping horse a nasty gash along his forearm, where a loose fence wire had torn through his shirt and skin both. "You came out here alone in the dark," he said, wincing as she helped him up onto her own horse, "for a torn arm and a lame horse. I came out here because you didn't come home." Abigail said, voice tight with the fear she was only now allowing herself to feel. "Don't you ever do that to me again, Colt Dawson. Don't you dare stay out past dark without word, not with everything we're carrying right now." "Didn't plan on it," he said, quieter now, watching her face in the lantern light, seeing something there that struck him harder than the pain in his arm. "You were scared." "Of course I was scared." Her voice cracked just slightly, the first crack he'd ever heard in it. "I've buried a father, and near enough buried a mother from grief besides. I am not interested in burying a husband too, not after I've only just started building something worth keeping." He reached out with his good arm and pulled her close right there in the dark, the horses shifting patiently beneath them, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, simply held on. Two people who had each spent a lifetime being told they didn't need anyone, finally admitting, without words, exactly how much they'd come to need each other. They rode back to the ranch in silence, and once his arm was cleaned and bandaged at the kitchen table by lamplight, Abigail sat across from him, her hands still faintly trembling from the ride. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Something I haven't told you yet." "All right. There was a man back in Ohio, before your letter came." She stared at her own hands folded tight in her lap. "His name was Thomas Whitcomb. We were engaged for near a year. I thought I truly believed that he loved me for who I was." Colt said nothing, letting her find her own way through it. 3 weeks before the wedding, his mother came to visit from Cincinnati. Fine woman, fashionable, the kind who measured everything by how it looked to other people. She took one look at me and told Thomas right in front of me that she wouldn't have a daughter-in-law who embarrassed the family name at church socials. Abigail's voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the way it went when she was holding something back with everything she had. Thomas didn't defend me. Didn't say a single word in my favor. Just stood there and let her say it, and 2 days later he came to my mother's house and told me he thought it best we call things off. Said he cared for me a great deal, but that some sacrifices weren't fair to ask of a man, and my size was one of them. "Abigail, let me finish." She held up a hand, steadying herself. "I spent the next 4 years being the woman that town whispered about. The one Thomas Whitcomb left standing at the church door nearly, though we never quite made it that far. Every social, every church supper, I felt every eye in that room measuring me and finding me wanting, same as his mother had. So when your letter came plain and honest, talking about fence lines and hard work, and never once mentioning what I ought to look like, I thought, here finally is a man who might actually see me as something other than a sacrifice somebody has to talk themselves into making. Colt reached across the table and took her hand careful of his bandaged arm, and held it with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size and strength of him. Thomas Whitcomb was a coward, he said, low and certain. Any man who lets his mother decide who he loves never deserved you in the first place. I know that now, Abigail said. Took me a long while to believe it, though. Believe it, Colt said. Because I have looked at you standing in a stage-stop crowd in a general store in a wolf-dark pasture with a rifle nowhere near steady enough for the danger you rode into, and not once, not for one single moment, have I thought you were anything but exactly enough. Abigail's eyes filled, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, she let herself cry not from sorrow, but from something closer to relief. The particular relief of finally being believed. Word of the growing debt trouble, as such things always did in a small town, eventually reached beyond the walls of that kitchen. Hank Dooley rode up a week later with news that Ashworth had been asking around quietly about the Dawson Ranch's herd size and grazing condition, the kind of careful reconnaissance a banker conducts before he intends to call a loan rather than renew it. He's building a case, Hank said grimly, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. Talking to buyers, talking to the assessor's office. I don't like the shape of it, Colt. Neither do I, Colt admitted. There's talk, too, Hank added, more reluctant now, that Ashworth's been putting money quiet into buying up options on other parcels along that creek, like he already knows he's getting yours, and he's planning what comes after. The implication settled over the yard like a physical weight. If Ashworth was already positioning to acquire the surrounding land, it meant he had no intention of ever renewing the note in good faith. He intended to take the creek parcel outright, and likely knew precisely how close to the edge the Dawson Ranch already stood. We need proof, Abigail said once Hank had ridden off and she and Colt stood alone in the fading light. Proof of what he's planning. A note structured to fail isn't illegal on its own, but a banker deliberately engineering a rancher's ruin for personal gain, that's a different matter entirely if it can be shown plain. How do we show it plain? Man like Ashworth doesn't leave his schemes lying out for anybody to find. Every scheme leaves a trail somewhere, Abigail said, jaw set with the same determination she'd shown facing down Ezra Tuttle. Loan records, land office filings. Somebody in that county seat has seen something, kept some paper, noticed some pattern. We just have to find who. The weeks that followed took on a new urgency, the ranch work continuing alongside a second quieter labor letters written to the county seat requesting copies of land filings. Careful questions asked of neighboring ranchers who might have crossed paths with Ashworth's dealings, before evenings spent poring over Colt's father's old papers, searching for any detail about the original note that might reveal something useful. It was Abigail who found the first real thread buried in a box of old correspondence Colt hadn't opened since his father's death. A letter from another rancher, 2 counties over, a man named Otis Barnwell, whose land had been taken by Ashworth under strikingly similar circumstances 4 years prior. Look at this, Abigail said, pulling the letter free, her hands trembling slightly with the discovery. Barnwell wrote your father warning him about Ashworth's terms years back. Said the man had done the same thing to him, structured a note that looked generous on its face, but had a review clause buried deep enough that most ranchers never noticed it until it was too late to renegotiate. My father never mentioned this. Maybe he never saw it clear himself until it was already too late for him, too, Abigail said gently. But this Barnwell, if he's still alive, if he's still nearby, he might know exactly how Ashworth structures these schemes. Might know exactly what proof would hold up if we ever needed to challenge him. County records show he moved to a smaller spread outside Miles City after he lost his land, Colt said, remembering now a distant piece of old gossip suddenly taking on new weight. Never thought much of it at the time, Didn't know it was Ashworth's doing. Then we ride to Miles City, Abigail said, already reaching for her coat. Because if this Barnwell can tell us how Ashworth operates, we might finally have the beginning of a real defense. That's near 2 days' ride each way. Ranch can't run itself that long, not with everything else we've got sitting unfinished before winter. Abigail paused at the door, weighing the truth of that against the urgency burning in her chest. Then I'll go alone, she said. You stay. Keep the ranch running. Keep an eye on anything Ashworth tries while we're vulnerable. I'll ride to Miles City, talk to Barnwell, and be back within the week. Absolutely not, Colt said, more forceful than she'd heard him in weeks. I am not sending my wife 2 days' ride alone through open country, not with everything uncertain right now. Colt Dawson. I rode straight at a pack of wolves in the dark not 3 weeks past. I think I can manage a stagecoach to Miles City. That's different. It is not different, Abigail said, closing the distance between them. Her voice firm, but not unkind. You cannot protect me from every danger in this world, same as I cannot protect you from every danger in yours. We agreed that first week that whatever came at one of us, came at both. This is what that agreement looks like in practice, Colt, trusting each other to carry our share, even when it's frightening. He studied her a long moment, the fear plain in his eyes, warring visibly against the truth of what she was saying. Finally, he exhaled some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Take the good horse, he said quietly, and you send word the moment you arrive safe. I mean it, Abigail. The moment. I will. And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you turn around and come home. Barnwell's information isn't worth your safety. Nothing is worth more to me than coming home to you, Abigail said, and kissed him quick and fierce before he could argue further. She left before dawn 2 days later, riding hard toward the county seat where the stage to Miles City departed. Colt watching from the porch until she was nothing more than a dark shape against the pale morning sky, swallowed eventually by the tree line, carrying with her not just the hope of finding evidence against Ashworth, but something far more fragile and far more valuable, the trust of a man who had watched 5 women flee this same mountain, now trusting the 6th to ride straight into danger and come home again, because that was simply who she was. The days she was gone passed slower than any Colt had known since his parents' deaths. Word came on the 4th day not from Abigail directly, but from a writer passing through a brief note scrawled in her decisive hand, confirming she'd found Barnwell, that he was willing to talk, that she would be home within 3 days, carrying, she hoped, exactly what they needed. But the note carried a second line beneath the first one that settled cold and heavy in Colt's chest the moment he read it. Ashworth's man has been asking after me in Miles City. Someone knows I'm here. Be careful. I'll explain everything when I'm home. 2 days later, a rider Colt did not recognize came up the ranch trail at midday, moving unhurried, deliberate, the kind of man who wanted to be noticed taking his time. He was lean-dressed plain, but for a silver ring that caught the light when he tipped his hat, and he reined up at the edge of the yard without dismounting. You'd be Dawson, the man said. Depends who's asking. Name's Farrow. I work for Mr. Ashworth. The man's eyes moved slow across the yard, cataloging everything the way a man catalogs something he expects to own soon. Mr. Ashworth wanted me to pass along a friendly word. Says he understands your wife's been asking questions down in Miles City. Says he'd hate for anybody to get the wrong idea about the nature of his business dealings. Colt's hands had gone very still at his sides. That a threat, Farrow? Just a friendly word. Farrow repeated, a thin smile touching his mouth. Mr. Ashworth's a reasonable man. Reasonable men don't like surprises come spring review. Might be worth reminding your wife that some questions are better left unasked for everybody's comfort. Get off my land, Colt said low and even. Farrow held his gaze a moment longer, unbothered, then touched his hat brim and turned his horse without another word, leaving behind him a threat wrapped so carefully in politeness that a man could almost convince himself it hadn't been a threat at all. Almost. She arrived home the following evening, 2 days ahead of her own estimate, driving the borrowed horse hard up the final stretch of trail, and Colt was waiting on the porch before she'd even fully reined in, pulling her down from the saddle, into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could have of exactly how frightened he'd been in her absence. "I'm all right," she said into his shoulder. "I'm home. I'm all right." A man named Pharaoh came by. "Works for Ashworth." Abigail pulled back, alarm sharpening her features. "What did he say?" "Enough that I know Ashworth already knows exactly where you've been and exactly who you talked to." Colt's jaw was tight. "He's threatening us careful and quiet the way a man like that always threatens." "Then we're on the right path," Abigail said, something fierce kindling behind her exhaustion. "A man doesn't send threats over nothing, Colt. Barnwell gave me exactly what we needed." She led him inside, pulling a bundle of papers from her travel bag, spreading them across the kitchen table, with hands that hadn't yet stopped trembling from 2 days of hard riding. "Otis Barnwell lost his land to Ashworth 4 years back, same scheme, near identical language in the note," she said. "But he kept everything, every letter, every notice, every appraisal Ashworth's bank ever sent him. He said he always suspected he wasn't the only one Ashworth had done this to. What's it show? A pattern." Abigail spread the papers wider. "Ashworth buries a review clause in dense legal language most ranchers never think to question. Then before review, he quietly buys up options on the surrounding land, same as Hank told us he's already doing along your creek. So when he seizes one parcel, he's really consolidating an entire section of grazing land and water rights sold off afterward to cattle syndicates out of Cheyenne for triple what any rancher could pay." Colt stared at the papers, the full shape of the scheme finally visible after months of gnawing suspicion. "He's been doing this for years. At least 4. And here's the piece that matters most." Abigail's finger tapped the final page. "Barnwell kept a letter Ashworth's own clerk sent him by mistake, a memorandum discussing the land's resale value to the syndicate, dated months before the note was ever called due. That's proof he knew exactly what he intended before he ever gave Barnwell a chance to pay. If he's done the same with my father's note, then somewhere in Ashworth's own bank, there's likely a similar memorandum. We just have to find it or find someone inside willing to say what they've seen." It was Little Feather who brought the piece that changed everything, arriving one gray October morning, with news from her nephew, who worked the bank's own stable in town. "There's a young clerk," Little Feather said once she and Abigail were alone. "Name of Wilson. My nephew says he's been drinking heavier than usual and overheard him telling another hand deep in his cups that he'd seen something in the ledgers that made him sick to his stomach. Something about your husband's note in particular. Would he talk to us directly? That I don't know. But frightened men sometimes need only the right person to ask the right question at the right moment." Little Feather studied her. "There's a church social this Sunday. Might be easier to approach him there casual-like." Colt grew increasingly uneasy as Sunday approached. "I don't like it," he said the night before. "Sending you in there alone, trying to pry a confession out of a frightened man while Ashworth's whole town watches." "I won't be prying anything," Abigail said. "I'll be having a friendly conversation at a church social, same as anybody else there." Sunday arrived cool and bright. The whole valley gathered outside the little clapboard church for the autumn social. Abigail moved through the crowd until she spotted him, a slight sandy-haired young man standing apart, a cup of cider untouched in his hand, shadows beneath his eyes. "Mr. Wilson," she said, approaching with easy warmth. "Abigail Dawson. I don't believe we've met proper." He startled. "Mrs. Dawson? No, we haven't." "I know about the ledgers, Mr. Wilson," she said low enough that no one nearby could hear. "I know something in them made you sick enough to drink over it. I'm not here to trap you into anything. I'm here because a good man is about to lose everything he and his father spent their lives building over a scheme I believe you've already seen the shape of firsthand." Wilson's face had gone pale. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Abigail said, gentler still. "If your conscience ever needs somewhere safe to unburden itself, my husband and I would listen and protect whatever you told us as carefully as our own lives." For a long moment, Wilson said nothing, his eyes fixed on some middle distance. "There's a ledger," he said finally, so quietly she had to lean in. "Kept separate from the regular books. I've seen it twice by accident, and both times I wish to God I hadn't." "What does it show?" Wilson's throat worked, his eyes darting toward the crowd. "It shows your husband's note isn't the only one," he whispered. "There's a list, Mrs. Dawson, Barnwell, 4 others besides going back nearly 6 years. All the same pattern, all already sold or promised to the same syndicate out of Cheyenne." Before Abigail could press further, before she could ask the single question burning loudest in her chest, a shadow fell across them both, and she turned to find Silas Ashworth himself standing not 10 feet away, smiling with the particular coldness of a man who had just watched something he valued slip further from his control than he had ever intended to allow. "Mrs. Dawson," Ashworth said pleasantly, tipping his hat, his eyes moving from her to the visibly shaken young clerk beside her, cataloging the scene with the swift, merciless precision of a man who had built an empire on noticing exactly the details other people hoped he would miss. "I do hope young Wilson here hasn't been boring you with bank talk. Terrible habit of his mixing business with a pleasant Sunday afternoon." The pleasant smile did not waver, but something in his eyes fixed now on Abigail with unmistakable warning promised that whatever quiet, careful war had been building between them since the day she'd first arrived in Bitterroot Gulch was about to become considerably less quiet and considerably more dangerous than either of them had allowed themselves to believe it could become. "Mr. Ashworth." Abigail kept her voice even, though her pulse had gone hard and fast in her throat. "We were only discussing the harvest. Weren't we, Mr. Wilson?" Wilson's mouth opened, opened again, no sound coming out at all. "Of course you were." Ashworth's smile widened, though it never once touched his eyes. "Wilson, Mr. Crandall's been asking after you by the lemonade table. Something about a discrepancy in the Tuesday deposits. Best go see to it." Wilson fled without another word, cider cup abandoned on a fence post, and Abigail watched him go with a sinking certainty that whatever courage he'd found in the last 5 minutes had just been frightened straight back out of him. "You've made quite an impression on my staff, Mrs. Dawson," Ashworth said once Wilson was out of earshot. "I do hope you're not filling that boy's head with fanciful notions about my business dealings. Young men his age are prone to exaggeration when a pretty woman shows them particular attention." "I wasn't showing him attention, Mr. Ashworth. I was showing him kindness. Might be you've forgotten the difference running a bank the way you run it." Something flickered behind his eyes, quick and cold. "Careful, Mrs. Dawson. Accusations, even quiet ones at a church social, have a way of finding their way back to the person who made them, and not always in a manner that person enjoys." "Is that a threat?" "That's neighborly advice." He touched his hat brim, the same gesture Pharaoh had used at the ranch, and Abigail understood suddenly that it was a practiced signature, a small courtesy, extended right before the knife went in. "Enjoy the social, Mrs. Dawson. Do give my regards to your husband." He walked away, unhurried, greeting other townsfolk with easy warmth as he went, and Abigail stood rooted in place a long moment, watching him work the crowd, like a man who had never once in his life felt the weight of anything he'd done to someone else. She found Colt waiting near the wagon at the edge of the churchyard, and the look on his face told her he'd seen enough of the exchange from a distance to guess most of the shape of it. "What happened?" "Ashworth caught me talking to Wilson. Wilson knows something, Colt, a separate ledger, a list of names, yours and Barnwell's, and 4 others besides, all marked for the same syndicate. But Ashworth pulled him away before he could say more, and I don't know if he'll ever find the nerve to talk again after that." "Then we go around him," Colt said, already moving toward the wagon. "Find another way to get what we need." "There may not be time to find another way." Abigail climbed up beside him, glancing back once toward the churchyard, where Ashworth stood laughing with a cluster of ranchers playing the part of respectable neighbor for an audience that had no idea what lay underneath the performance. "He knows we're close now, Colt. A man like that doesn't wait around once he knows he's been found out." She was right, though neither of them yet understood how quickly Ashworth intended to move, nor how far he was willing to go to bury what Wilson had nearly told her. They felt it before they saw it riding up the final stretch of trail toward home in the last gray light of evening, a wrongness in the air acrid and sharp, carried down the mountain on the same wind that had once carried wolf song to their ears. "Smoke," Colt said, already spurring the horses faster. They came around the last bend to find the hay barn, engulfed flames climbing high enough to paint the darkening sky orange, the terrified bawling of cattle rising from the corral nearest the blaze. Little Feather, already at the well, hauling water in a bucket brigade with two of the hired hands who'd stayed late. "Get the stock clear," Colt shouted, already leaping from the wagon before it had fully stopped. "The corral fence. Abigail, open it now before the fire jumps the gap." Abigail didn't hesitate. She ran for the corral gate, hands shaking as she fought the latch cattle shoving past her in a panicked crush the moment it swung free, streaming out into the darkness away from the heat and smoke. Behind her, Colt had joined the bucket line, his shirt already scorched at one shoulder, passing water hand over hand in a desperate losing effort against flames that had clearly caught with help. No accidental spark climbed that fast, that hungry on a night without lightning or careless lantern. "It's arson," Little Feather said grimly, passing a bucket without breaking rhythm. "Smell that. Coal oil. Somebody poured it deliberate." The barn was a loss within the hour, nothing left standing by the time the flames finally guttered down to embers, but a blackened skeleton of timber, and the sick, hollow knowledge that someone had walked onto their land and set fire to it with murderous intent. Colt found the proof near the tree line, at first light. Boot prints pressed deep in the soft earth, a broken coal oil tin discarded carelessly in the brush, and the unmistakable mark of a silver ring pressed faint into the mud beside it. The same ring Pharaoh had worn the day he'd delivered Ashworth's careful, polite threat. "He's escalating," Abigail said, staring at the print, her jaw tight with a fury that had burned through every trace of fear. From threats to fire in the span of a single week. "He's frightened Colt. Truly frightened, or he'd never have moved this fast, this reckless." "Frightened men are dangerous men," Colt said. "We nearly lost the whole herd last night. Next time it might not be a barn." "We need Wilson's testimony now," Abigail said. "A man willing to burn a barn to protect his secrets is a man capable of considerably worse, and Wilson knows that better than anyone working inside that bank every day." "I'll ride for town," Colt said. "Talk to Hank, see if he can carry word to Wilson private, away from Ashworth's watching eyes." "I'm coming with you." "Abigail, the herd's scattered half across the mountain, the barn's ash, and somebody just proved they're willing to burn us out. Somebody needs to stay. Keep watch. Keep this place from burning down entirely while we're both away." She hated the sense in it, hated it with every fiber of the fierce independence that had carried her up this mountain in the first place. But she recognized the truth of his argument, even through the frustration. "Go then," she said. "But you send word the moment you've spoken to Hank. And Colt." She caught his arm before he could mount up something raw and urgent in her voice. "Be careful. Whatever's coming, I need you to come home from it." "Always?" he said, and kissed her hard before swinging up into the saddle. He was gone only a few hours, but they were among the longest hours of Abigail's life. When he finally returned, his face carried news that told her before he'd even spoken a word that something significant had shifted. "Wilson's gone," Colt said, dismounting heavy with exhaustion. Hank went to the bank to find him quiet, and Ashworth's clerk said, "Wilson resigned this morning, packed his room at the boarding house, and left town on the first stage out. Nobody knows where he's headed." Abigail's stomach dropped. "Ashworth got to him." "Maybe. Or maybe the fire scared him enough to run rather than talk. Either way, whatever he knew, whatever proof might have been in his head, it's gone now, riding a stagecoach in some direction nobody can track." The setback landed heavier than either of them expected. Abigail sank down onto the porch step, the accumulated exhaustion of the fire, the sleepless night, the shattered hope all catching up with her at once. "We're out of time," she said quietly. "First a threat, then fire, and now our one witness has vanished. What's left, Colt?" "Barnwell's papers are still real," Colt said. "The letter from Ashworth's clerk is still real. It's not everything we hoped for, but it's not nothing either. It's not enough to stop a foreclosure, and you know it." They sat together in silence a while, the smoldering barn, a bitter reminder of exactly how far Ashworth was willing to go, until finally Abigail lifted her head, a new and different kind of determination, replacing the despair that had briefly claimed her. "There's still the townspeople," she said slowly. "Barnwell's not the only rancher Ashworth's ruined. If there truly are 4 others besides him, some of them must still be nearby, still angry, still willing to speak, if somebody finally asks them plain, instead of letting them suffer alone and ashamed, believing their own bad luck was to blame instead of a banker's design. That could take weeks we don't have. Then we'd best start today," Abigail said, already rising. "Because sitting here mourning what we lost isn't going to save this ranch, Colt Dawson. Only fighting harder is." The days that followed became a blur of hard riding and harder conversations. Colt and Abigail splitting the search between them across 3 counties. The first 2 visits yielded nothing but polite denial. Old wounds too raw to reopen for strangers. But the third, a weathered rancher named Silas Pruitt, broke down entirely at his own kitchen table the moment Abigail mentioned Ashworth's name. "4 years I've carried the shame of it," Pruitt said, hands shaking around a cup of coffee gone cold. "4 years believing I was simply a poor manager. You're telling me it wasn't my failure at all. That man planned it from the start." "We believe so," Abigail said gently. "If you'd be willing to put what happened to you in writing sworn before a notary alongside others who've suffered the same." "I'll do it," Pruitt said before she'd even finished the offer. "God help me, I'll do it gladly." By the end of the second week, they had 4 sworn statements beyond Barnwell's own 4 ranchers, whose lives Ashworth had quietly dismantled across 6 years of patient calculated cruelty. It was returning from the last of these visits, riding the long trail home in the fading autumn light, that disaster finally struck, in the way the mountain itself had always threatened entirely, apart from anything Ashworth had engineered. The storm came fast, temperatures dropping violently within the space of an hour. Wind driving snow sideways hard enough to blind a rider within a dozen yards of the trail. Colt's horse, spooked by a sudden crack of thunder, rolling unnaturally through the snow, reared hard on a narrow stretch of trail above a rocky ravine, and Colt went down. "Colt!" Abigail's scream tore through the howling wind as she watched him disappear over the edge, the horse scrambling back onto solid ground, riderless, its eyes wild with panic. She was off her own horse and scrambling down the treacherous slope before conscious thought had fully caught up with instinct. "Colt, answer me." A groan faint carried up from somewhere below, and she followed it until she found him crumpled against a boulder 20 feet down his leg, bent at an angle that made her stomach lurch even before he spoke. "Legs broke," he managed, teeth gritted against obvious agony. "Bad break, Abigail. I'm getting you out of here. Storm's too heavy. You can't carry me and lead 2 horses through this. Watch me," Abigail said, already working her coat off to wrap around him against the brutal cold. "I am not leaving you on this mountain to freeze Colt Dawson." What followed was the hardest hour of her life, dragging him up the slope inch by agonizing inch, using a makeshift splint fashioned from a broken branch and strips torn from her own petticoat. "Nearest help's the Pruitt place," Colt gasped, fighting to stay conscious. 2 miles back, closer than home in this. Silas Pruitt's lamp, burning steady in his window through the storm, was the single most beautiful sight Abigail had ever seen in her life, and he came running the moment her frantic pounding reached his door, hauling Colt inside, laying him carefully near the fire. "Legs broke bad," Pruitt said grimly. "Needs a proper doctor. Nearest one's in Bitterroot Gulch, and that trail's near impassable in this storm." "Then I'll make it passable," Abigail said, already moving toward the door. "Ma'am, you can't ride to town in this. You'll freeze before you're halfway there. I watched 5 women flee this mountain because they thought it would break them," Abigail said, turning back with a fierce, unshakable resolve. "I am not about to let it take my husband instead. Lend me your freshest horse, Mr. Pruitt. I'm riding for that doctor." She rode into the teeth of the storm, alone, half frozen. Guided more by instinct and stubborn will than any clear sense of the trail beneath her, and the ride into Bitterroot Gulch that night would be spoken of in that town for years afterward. She burst into the doctor's office, half frozen, barely able to form words through chattering teeth, and Doc Riley took one look at her condition and moved with immediate, practiced urgency. "Broke leg, you said. How bad?" "Bad. Bone might be through the skin. I couldn't tell for certain in the dark and the snow." "Give me 10 minutes." Doc Riley was already pulling on his coat. "You did right coming for me, Mrs. Dawson, storm or no storm. A break like that left untreated too long, a man can lose the leg entirely or worse." Doc Riley worked through the remainder of that night setting the break properly. Colt gritting his teeth against pain that would have broken lesser men into screaming, Abigail holding his hand the entire time. "You're going to be all right," she told him over and over. "I did not drag you up that ravine and ride through a blizzard alone just to lose you now." "I hear you," Colt managed through gritted teeth. "Abigail, what you did tonight. Don't talk. Save your strength. I have to say it." His hand tightened around hers. 5 women ran from far less than tonight. You rode straight into a blizzard alone to save a man half this county. Still whispers you settled for out of desperation. I don't have words enough to... Then don't find them, Abigail said gently, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. Just heal. That's all I need from you right now. By dawn, the storm had finally broken, leaving the mountain blanketed in heavy, silent white. Colt's leg was set. Doc Riley confident it would heal clean, given proper rest. Though it would be weeks, perhaps months before he'd walk without a limp. They stayed at the Pruitt homestead 3 days, and it was there on the second night that Colt finally said what had clearly been building in his chest. I've been lying here thinking, he said quietly, about how close I came to dying on that mountain last night. Don't think about that part. I have to, because it made me understand something plain. He caught her hand, meeting her eyes with an intensity that stole the breath from her chest. This whole fight, the ranch, the note, Ashworth schemes, none of it means anything if I lose you in the process. I'd rather walk away from every acre of that land tomorrow than risk losing you to it. You won't lose me, Abigail said fiercely. And we are not walking away from that ranch, Colt Dawson. Your father built it. You rebuilt it. I intend to help you keep it whatever it costs either of us. Even after last night. Especially after last night, Abigail said. Because last night proved something to me. Whatever this mountain throws at us, whatever Ashworth throws at us, we survive it together. 5 brides ran from this mountain? Colt said quietly. I used to think that meant something was wrong with me. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now? I think they simply weren't the right woman. I think I was always waiting for somebody strong enough to ride into a blizzard for me. I just didn't know it until you did. They returned to the ranch 3 days later. Colt propped carefully in the wagon bed, his splinted leg immobile. Abigail driving slow and careful over every rut and stone. Little Feather met them in the yard relief plain on her weathered face, and behind her, unexpectedly, stood Hank Dooley, hat in hand, along with 2 other neighboring ranchers. Word travels fast on this mountain, Hank said, helping ease Colt down from the wagon. Whole county's talking about how Mrs. Dawson rode alone through that blizzard to fetch the doctor. Folks who used to laugh at the size of you, ma'am, are singing a considerably different tune this week. I didn't do it for their opinion, Abigail said, though something in her chest eased slightly nonetheless. Didn't figure you did, Hank said. But it matters anyway. Ashworth's built his whole scheme on nobody in this county caring enough about each other to compare notes. Story like yours, spreading mouth to mouth through every ranch between here and the county seat. That's the kind of thing that makes folks start comparing notes, whether Ashworth likes it or not. The 2 ranchers with him stepped forward, then wanting to add their own long-buried grievances to the growing pile of evidence. Man foreclosed on my brother 2 years back. The taller of the 2 said, jaw tight with old anger, finally given permission to surface. Always figured it was bad luck. Hearing about Barnwell, about Pruitt, about the pattern of it, I don't believe in bad luck anymore. I believe in a banker who's been robbing this county blind for years, and I want to help however I can to see him answer for it. By the time the sun set that evening, painting the snow-dusted ridgeline gold and violet, Abigail sat at the kitchen table with 2 new statements added to their growing collection. Colt resting nearby with his splinted leg, propped carefully on a stool, watching her work with an expression that mixed exhaustion pain and unmistakable pride in equal measure. 7 statements now, she said, arranging the papers carefully. 7 ranchers, all telling variations of the same story, all independent of one another, all matching the pattern Barnwell first described. That's not a coincidence anymore. That's a case. Is it enough to bring before a judge? I believe it might be, Abigail said, though a shadow of old caution tempered the hope in her voice. But Ashworth's not a man who'll simply accept defeat quietly, not after everything he's already shown himself willing to do to protect this scheme. A barn fire was his opening move. I don't imagine he intends it to be his last. Colt reached across the table, taking her hand, despite the awkward angle, forced by his splinted leg, his grip fierce despite the exhaustion still weighing on him. Whatever comes next, he said, we face it the same way we faced tonight, the same way we faced that blizzard. Together. Together. Abigail agreed, and outside the mountains settled into the deep, waiting quiet of full winter's approach, holding whatever Silas Ashworth intended to do next, just beyond the edge of what either of them could yet see coming. Judge Harlan Cobb held circuit court in the county seat only once every 6 weeks, and word came by rider, 3 days later, that his docket would open the following Monday, barely enough time to prepare, but time enough, Abigail insisted, if they moved fast and moved smart. 7 statements, she said, spreading the papers across the kitchen table for what felt like the 100th time, checking each signature, each date, each careful notarization. Barnwell's letter from the clerk. That's what we bring before him. It's not everything, Colt said, shifting carefully in his chair, his splinted leg still propped and aching. Wilson's gone. Whatever he knew about that separate ledger, we can't prove it without him. Then we make do with what we've got. Abigail's jaw was set, the same fierce determination that had carried her through a blizzard now turned toward a different kind of fight entirely. A judge doesn't need everything, Colt. He needs enough to see the shape of the pattern, and I believe we've got that now. News of their gathering evidence had spread faster than either of them anticipated, and by the time Monday arrived, the little courthouse in the county seat was packed tighter than either of them had ever seen it. Ranchers and their wives crowded along the back wall, spilling out onto the steps outside. Silas Ashworth arrived precisely on time, immaculate in his black frock coat, flanked by a lawyer from Helena, whose fees alone likely exceeded what most ranchers in that room earned in a season. He nodded politely to acquaintances as he passed utterly composed a man who had clearly convinced himself that money and connections would carry him through whatever inconvenience this hearing represented. Mrs. Dawson. He paused beside their table, just long enough to offer a small, cold smile. I do admire your persistence. Misguided, but admirable. We'll see whose persistence proves misguided, Mr. Ashworth. Abigail said evenly, refusing to let the barb land the way he intended it to. Judge Cobb called the court to order with the weary efficiency of a man who had presided over 100 property disputes and expected this one to unfold no differently than the rest. But as Abigail rose to present their case, laying out Barnwell's letter, the sworn statements from 7 ranchers across 3 counties, the pattern of quiet land consolidation stretching back 6 years, something in the room began to shift. Objection. Ashworth's lawyer interjected smoothly more than once. Hearsay, Your Honor. Speculation. My client's business dealings, however unfortunate for these ranchers individually, do not constitute fraud simply because several men experienced similar misfortune. Similar misfortune. Abigail repeated, turning to address the judge directly, her voice carrying clear across the packed room. Your Honor, 7 ranchers independent of one another describe the exact same clause buried in the exact same language, followed by the exact same pattern of land acquisition benefiting the exact same buyer 6 years running. I would ask the court respectfully how many coincidences it takes before a pattern becomes a scheme. A murmur moved through the crowd, and Judge Cobb's expression sharpened with genuine interest. "Mrs. Dawson makes a fair point," he said. "Mr. Ashworth's counsel, do you have an explanation for the consistency of these terms across so many notes?" The lawyer hesitated just slightly before recovering his smooth composure. "Standard banking practice, Your Honor. Consistency in loan terms is hardly evidence of malicious intent. Perhaps not on its own," Judge Cobb allowed. "But I confess myself curious about this separate ledger Mrs. Dawson's brief references, a document I understand that a former clerk of Mr. Ashworth's bank allegedly discovered before his sudden departure from town." Ashworth's composure flickered just barely, but Abigail caught it, filed it away, understanding that they'd found the one thread capable of truly unraveling him. "Unfortunately, Your Honor," Abigail said, "that clerk of Mr. Wilson left town rather suddenly, following an incident of arson at our ranch, an incident we believe connects directly to Mr. Ashworth's efforts to silence anyone who might corroborate the existence of that ledger." "That is a serious accusation, Mrs. Dawson," Judge Cobb said, made without the witness present to support it. "I'm aware, Your Honor. I only ask the court to consider the timing. A clerk who nearly speaks to me at a church social. A barn burned to the ground within days. That same clerk vanishing from town the following morning." The courtroom had gone very quiet, and Ashworth, for the first time since Abigail had known him, looked genuinely rattled, his careful composure cracking at the edges as murmurs rippled through the gathered crowd. It was at that precise moment, as Judge Cobb prepared to call a recess, that the courthouse doors swung open, and a thin, travel-worn figure stepped through them, hat clutched nervously in both hands, sandy hair disheveled from hard riding. "Wilson!" A collective gasp rippled through the room, and Abigail felt her heart lurch with a hope she barely dared to trust. "Your Honor." Wilson's voice shook, but he pressed forward regardless, walking straight up the center aisle, despite Ashworth's furious glare fixed on him from across the room. "My name is Thomas Wilson. I was a clerk at Mr. Ashworth's bank until 3 weeks ago. I have information relevant to this proceeding, and I've come a long way to give it, and I intend to give it whether Mr. Ashworth likes it or not." "Your Honor, this is highly irregular," Ashworth's lawyer protested, already on his feet. "Mr. Wilson is welcome to address the court," Judge Cobb said, silencing the objection with a raised hand. "Proceed, Mr. Wilson, and be sworn." Wilson took the oath with trembling hands, and once seated began to speak haltingly at first, then with growing steadiness. "Mr. Ashworth keeps a separate ledger apart from the regular bank records," he said. "I saw it twice by accident. It lists notes structured identically to Mr. Dawson's, the same review clause, the same pattern alongside projected resale values to a cattle syndicate based in Cheyenne. Dates on those projections predate the loan review deadlines by months. It shows Mr. Ashworth knew before he ever extended credit to these men exactly how and when he intended to seize their land. And why?" Judge Cobb asked. "Did you not come forward with this sooner, Mr. Wilson?" "Because I was afraid, Your Honor. The night the Dawson barn burned, I recognized a man leaving town the following morning, one of Mr. Ashworth's associates, a man named Farrow. I ran because I was a coward, and I did not want to be next." "What changed your mind?" "Mrs. Dawson," Wilson said simply, his eyes finding Abigail's across the courtroom. "I've been in Miles City 3 weeks, drinking myself sick with guilt every night, remembering the kindness she showed me at that social. Word reached me of this hearing. I decided I'd rather live afraid and honest than safe and ashamed for the rest of my life." The courtroom erupted into murmurs, and Ashworth finally visibly lost the composure he'd maintained since the moment he first walked through those doors. "Your Honor, this is preposterous. This witness is clearly—" "Sit down, counselor," Judge Cobb said sharply. "Mr. Wilson, is this separate ledger still in Mr. Ashworth's possession?" "To my knowledge, yes, Your Honor. Kept in a locked drawer of his private office desk, disguised among ordinary correspondence. I am ordering an immediate search of Mr. Ashworth's private office under supervision of the county sheriff. Mr. Ashworth, you will remain in this courtroom until that search is complete." The recess that followed stretched nearly 2 hours, the courtroom crowd growing restless, Colt gripping Abigail's hand tight beneath the table, both of them scarcely daring to breathe. When the sheriff finally returned ledger in hand, his expression grim, the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as one. "Found it exactly where the witness described, Your Honor," the sheriff said, placing the leather-bound book on the judge's bench. Judge Cobb spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing the ledger in silence before finally looking up. This ledger documents a pattern of predatory lending spanning 6 years and affecting no fewer than 11 ranching families in this county alone, including detailed projections of resale value to outside buyers dated well in advance of any loan review that would have triggered legitimate foreclosure. This is not standard banking practice, Mr. Ashworth. This is deliberate, calculated fraud, and I intend to see it prosecuted to the fullest extent this court allows. The courtroom erupted, ranchers rising to their feet. Some shouting, others simply staring in stunned silence at the man who had quietly ruined their neighbors across 6 patient, merciless years. "Order," Judge Cobb called, gaveling the room back to silence. "Mr. Ashworth, given the evidence before this court, I am voiding the review clause on the Dawson note effective immediately, and ordering a full accounting of every note structured under this same fraudulent pattern. Furthermore, given the credible testimony connecting you to an act of arson intended to intimidate witnesses in this matter, I am remanding you to the county sheriff's custody pending formal charges." 2 deputies moved forward, and Silas Ashworth, for 6 years, the most powerful and feared man in 3 counties, was led from that courtroom in handcuffs, his lawyer trailing helplessly behind him. The courtroom broke into something between celebration and disbelief. Ranchers embracing one another, several approaching Abigail directly. Hands extended, voices thick with gratitude. "You did this," Silas Pruitt said, gripping Abigail's hand fiercely. "For years, I carried the shame of losing my land, believing it was my own failure. You gave me my dignity back today, Mrs. Dawson. We couldn't have done it without you," Abigail said, meaning it fully. "Without all of you willing to stand up and tell the truth whatever it cost." Outside the courthouse, word of Ashworth's arrest already spreading through the county seat. Abigail found herself surrounded not by mockery or suspicion, but by something that looked remarkably like respect. Even Ezra Tuttle approached hat in hand. "Owe you an apology, Mrs. Dawson. That first day calling you names in the street. Man's got no excuse for that kind of cruelty." "Apology accepted, Mr. Tuttle," Abigail said, and found to her own surprise that she meant that too. Colt, still leaning heavily on a crutch, watched the exchange with quiet pride, and when Abigail finally made her way back to him, he pulled her close and kissed her soundly in front of the entire county seat. "5 brides ran from this mountain," he said. "The 6th one just brought down the most powerful man in 3 counties and saved every rancher he'd ever wronged in the process. I had help," Abigail said, though the fierce joy in her voice was unmistakable. "Yours, Wilson's, Barnwell's, Pruitt's, everyone who finally found the courage to speak." "You gave them that courage," Colt said. "Same as you gave it to me the day you spat in the dirt at my boots and dared this whole town to laugh at you." They found Little Feather waiting at the ranch with news that the bank's assets pending Ashworth's trial were being placed under temporary county administration, and that every note structured under his fraudulent pattern, including the Dawson note itself, was being reviewed for immediate cancellation of the predatory clause. "It's over," Abigail said softly, testing the words for truth. "It's over," Colt agreed, pulling her close. The days that followed brought a steady stream of visitors up the mountain trail, more than the ranch had seen in all the years Colt had lived there combined. Hank Dooley came by nearly every day that week, overseeing the barn's reconstruction, and one afternoon he pulled Colt aside. "Farrow's disappeared," Hank said quietly. "Sheriff went looking to bring him in on the arson charge, but the man's cleared out of the county entirely. Think he'll come back. Try something out of spite. Doubt it. Man like that only had teeth because Ashworth's money backed him." It was 2 days later, while Abigail was in town settling accounts at the general store, that Loretta Sims approached her hesitant, in a way Abigail had never once seen from the sharp-tongued woman who'd tried to needle her that first week. "Mrs. Dawson, what you did exposing Ashworth, it saved my own uncle's ranch too." He'd been quietly falling behind on a note near identical to Colt's, terrified to tell anyone. Loretta twisted her gloves in her hands. I was cruel to you that first week. I suppose I was jealous watching Colt look at you the way he never once looked at me. That's no excuse for cruelty, and I wanted you to know I'm sorry for it." "Thank you for saying so," Abigail said finally, and found she meant the forgiveness fully. "We've all got our own wounds, Miss Sims. I'd rather spend my energy healing mine than nursing grudges over yours." The barn raising itself drew nearly every family from 3 counties' wagons lining the trail, women setting up long tables laden with food, while the men worked raising timber that had only weeks before been nothing but ash and grief. "Never seen a barn raise so fast," Doc Riley commented, settling beside Colt with 2 cups of cider. "Whole county turned out." "Reckon they've got their reasons," Colt said, watching Abigail laugh at something Little Feather had said. "Woman rode through a blizzard to save your fool neck, then walked into a courtroom and brought down the most powerful man in 3 counties. Folks don't forget that kind of courage easy. You're a lucky man." "Luckiest in the territory," Colt said. By the time the sun began sinking toward the western ridge, the new barn stood complete, sturdier, and better built than the one that had burned. Reverend Pruitt, who had come up to bless the new construction, found a moment alone with Abigail near the porch steps. "I told your husband the day I married you both that something told me this one might actually last," he said. "I confess I didn't imagine quite how remarkable a story it would become." "Neither did I, Reverend. I only came up this mountain hoping to find a place where my strength might finally be wanted instead of mocked. I never expected to find a whole community waiting to be saved alongside it." As the last wagons rolled down the trail into the gathering dusk, Colt made his slow way over to where Abigail stood watching them go. "Quite a day," he said, settling beside her. "Quite a season," Abigail corrected, leaning into him. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Not fighting something for the first time in months." "Strange good or strange bad?" "Strange good," Abigail said, watching the last light fade gold over the mountains. "I think for the first time since I stepped off that stagecoach, I finally feel like I belong somewhere completely." "You do," Colt said simply. "You always did. Just took the rest of us a while to catch up to what I knew the moment you spat in the dirt at my boots and dared this whole town to keep laughing." That night, long after the fires from the barn-raising feast had burned down to embers and the last neighbor's wagon had disappeared down the mountain trail, Abigail sat at the kitchen table one final time with the papers that had consumed so many of their evenings since autumn. First began Barnwell's letter, the 7 sworn statements, the county clerk's confirmation that the review clause on their own note had been formally voided that very afternoon. She gathered them carefully, tied them together with a length of ribbon, and set them in the bottom drawer of the sideboard, no longer weapons needed for an ongoing war, but simply the record of a fight they had won. "Won't need those again," Colt said, watching from his chair, his splinted leg propped and healing steady now with each passing week. "No," Abigail agreed, closing the drawer with a quiet final click. "We won't." She crossed the kitchen and settled beside him, the fire crackling low and warm against the deepening winter cold outside, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the particular peace that comes only after a long, hard-fought battle has finally truly ended. "5 brides ran from this mountain, believing it would break them," Colt said eventually. "You proved this whole season that it was never the mountain that needed to change. It was everybody's understanding of what a woman like you was capable of surviving. I didn't survive it alone," Abigail said, resting her head against his shoulder. "It took both of us, Colt. It took this whole county in the end, once they finally found the courage to stand together instead of staying quiet and afraid." "Maybe so," Colt said. "But you were the one who taught this mountain how to do that. Nobody else managed it in all the years before you came." Outside, the snow continued falling steady and silent over the ranch, over the newly rebuilt barn, standing proud against the winter sky, over a county that had, in the span of a single remarkable season, learned something true about courage, about community, and about the particular strength of a woman who had once been laughed off a stagecoach and had answered that laughter in the end, not with anger, but with an unshakable determination to prove every single doubter wrong. She had come to Bitterroot Gulch, a stranger nobody expected to stay. She was leaving that chapter of her life, at last, as exactly what she had always been, Underneath the laughter and the doubt, a woman strong enough to save not just the man she loved, but the whole community that had once dismissed her as nothing more than a joke. Spring came late that year, later than most old-timers in the valley could recall. The snow lingering stubborn in the high passes longer than usual, but when it finally broke, it broke all at once. The creek running full and loud past the newly cleared pasture, wildflowers pushing up through soil that had spent the winter locked hard beneath ice. Colt walked without his crutch by the first thaw, a slight limp remaining permanent, according to Doc Riley. Though it never once slowed him down chasing cattle or mending fence alongside Abigail through the long working days of that first full season as husband and wife, with nothing left hanging over them but the ordinary honest work of building a life. Word arrived in early April that Silas Ashworth had been convicted on 11 counts of fraud and 1 count of arson, sentenced to 15 years at the territorial prison, his bank seized, and its assets distributed back where possible to the families he'd wronged across 6 patient merciless years. Abigail read the news in the county paper at the kitchen table, feeling less triumph than a quiet, settled sense of justice finally arrived, long overdue. 15 years, Colt said, reading over her shoulder. Man's near 60 already. Might not see the outside of that prison again. I take no pleasure in that, Abigail said slowly, folding the paper closed. But I take a great deal of peace in knowing he can't do to anybody else what he tried to do to us. It was that same spring, as the ranch settled into its new rhythm of recovery and growth, that a wagon rolled up the mountain trail carrying a passenger. Neither of them expected a thin, exhausted young woman named Sarah Kettleman, traveling with 2 small children, and precious little else, having lost her husband to a mining accident the previous winter, and her family's homestead to debts she hadn't known existed until the bank came calling. I heard talk in town, Sarah said, standing uncertain in the yard, one child clinging to her skirt while she balanced the younger on her hip, that you and your husband might have work for someone willing to earn her keep. I've nowhere else to go, Mrs. Dawson, and I'm not too proud to say it plain. Abigail looked at the young widow, recognizing in her exhausted eyes something she remembered intimately from her own life, the particular desperation of a woman the world had already begun writing off, waiting to see whether this new stranger would offer kindness or another cruel dismissal. There's a cabin down past the second pasture, Abigail said without a moment's hesitation. Small but sound and empty since Colt's hired hand married and moved into town last month. It's yours if you want it, and there's more work on this ranch than 2 people can rightly manage alone. Sarah's composure broke, then tears spilling freely down, cheeks gone hollow with worry and grief. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Because somebody once looked at me, laughed off a stagecoach by a whole town that had already decided who I was before I'd said a single word, and saw something worth taking a chance on anyway. Abigail said gently. I don't intend to be the kind of woman who forgets what that gift felt like now that I've got the chance to offer it to somebody else. Sarah stayed through that summer and into the following winter. And what began as simple charity soon revealed itself as something considerably more valuable to both women. Sarah possessed a quick mind for numbers that rivaled Abigail's own, and within months had taken over much of the ranch's bookkeeping. You've got a gift for this, Abigail told her one evening, reviewing figures Sarah had organized with a precision that put Colt's old careless ledgers to shame. I never knew I had it, Sarah admitted. My husband always said numbers weren't a woman's business. Guess I believed him until I didn't have any choice left but to prove him wrong. That's usually how it goes, Abigail said. The world tells us what we can't do right up until the moment we're forced to discover exactly what we can. The ranch in those years became something considerably more than the isolated, silent place it had once been, a gathering point for the whole valley's hard luck stories. Women and men alike who'd survived their own versions of Ashworth's cruelty, or the mountain's harsh indifference drawn by word of mouth, to a place where competence and courage mattered more than any measure of a person's size, wealth, or misfortune. Little Feather's grandniece came to learn preserving methods that winter staying on afterward as steady help through calving season. Old Silas Pruitt's youngest son apprenticed under Colt for 2 full seasons before striking out to start his own smaller spread nearby. Even Loretta Sims, in her own quiet way, became something like a friend. Never thought I'd see the day, Hank Dooley remarked, visiting one crisp autumn afternoon, 3 years after Abigail's arrival, watching the ranch's steady, purposeful activity spread across pastures that had once seemed too vast for any two people to properly manage. Colt Dawson's lonely mountain turned into the busiest, best-run spread in the whole county. "Wasn't me alone that did it," Colt said, watching Abigail cross the yard, calling instructions to Sarah's oldest boy with the same easy authority she'd once used to silence Ezra Tuttle's mockery on a dusty stagecoach afternoon years before. "No," Hank agreed. But it wouldn't have happened without her walking off that stage and refusing to run same as the 5 before her. There was one final piece of the old trouble that found its way back to them that third autumn, arriving not as danger this time, but as a strange, quiet kind of closure. A letter came addressed to Colt, postmarked from a mining town in Idaho, the handwriting unfamiliar until Abigail recognized the name signed at the bottom. Pharaoh. "What's it say?" she asked, watching Colt's face as he read. "Says he's been working an honest claim out west these past years," Colt said slowly. "Says the guilt of what he did here, the fire, the threats, never let him rest easy. Says he heard Ashworth got convicted, and knowing his old employer finally answered for what he'd built, made him want to answer for his own part in it too." Colt turned the letter over. "He sent money. Not much, but what he could spare, for the barn he helped burn down." "What do you want to do with it?" she asked. "Give it to Sarah," Colt said without hesitation. "Toward her own place when she's ready to strike out on her own proper." Sarah wept when they told her, insisting she couldn't possibly accept money from a man who'd once tried to burn them out, until Abigail took her hands and explained gently that the money wasn't really from Pharaoh at all anymore. "It's from every hard thing this mountain has already survived," Abigail said. "Consider it proof that nothing stays broken forever if enough people are willing to keep building past it." That evening, as the last light faded gold over ridge lines, Abigail had once found strange and forbidding. Now as familiar to her as her own hands, she and Colt sat together on the porch they'd rebuilt with their own labor, watching Sarah's children chase fireflies through the tall grass near the new barn. "Do you remember?" Abigail said softly. "Standing at that stage, stop listening to the whole town laugh at me? I remember thinking I'd never seen anybody stand so straight under that much cruelty. I was terrified," Abigail admitted. "I stood there spitting fire because it was the only thing standing between me and running straight back onto that stage in tears. Didn't look like fear to me. Looked like the bravest thing I'd ever witnessed. Maybe that's what real courage always looks like," Abigail said, leaning into him. "Not the absence of fear, but doing the brave thing anyway, right in the middle of being terrified. 5 brides ran from this mountain," Colt said. "And every one of them, I understand now, was simply looking for something this place could never have given them: safety without struggle, love without labor. You never once wanted that. No. I wanted a place where my strength mattered, where the whole loud, stubborn, capable shape of who I actually am could finally be an asset instead of something I had to apologize for. You found it." "We built it," Abigail corrected gently. "Together. That's the part those 5 women never understood, I think. They were waiting for somebody to hand them a finished home. I came up this mountain willing to build one instead, brick by brick, alongside a man willing to build it with me." On quiet evenings, decades after that first dusty stagecoach afternoon, Abigail would sometimes stand on the porch of the home she and Colt had built together, watching grandchildren chase fireflies through grass her own hands had once helped clear. Ezra Tuttle, grown old and gentle with the years, took to visiting most Sundays after church. Always with some small excuse, though. Everyone in the valley understood by then that the old man had simply grown fond of the woman he'd once mocked so carelessly on her very first afternoon in that town. "Never did properly thank you," he told her once, watching her granddaughter toddle unsteadily across the yard, chasing a barn cat twice her size. "For not holding that first day against me forever. None of us deserve grace entirely," Abigail said. "That's rather the point of it, Mr. Tuttle. It was never meant to be earned, only given and hopefully honored afterward." She had found that place. She had built it herself alongside a man who'd never once asked her to become smaller, quieter, or less than the whole formidable truth of who she actually was. Children in that valley grew up hearing Abigail Harper's story not as a cautionary tale about a woman who'd nearly been laughed out of town, but as a lesson about exactly the opposite, that the people the world was quickest to dismiss often possessed reserves of courage and capability. That dismissal itself could never diminish, only delay from finding the place where they were finally truly welcome. Colt, in his own quieter way, told the story differently to anyone who asked him directly. He never dwelled on the wolves or the fire or even the courtroom victory. He spoke instead always of that first afternoon at the stage stop, the sound of her suitcases hitting the dirt, the steadiness in her voice as she silenced a laughing crowd. "Best decision I ever made," he'd say, "was keeping my mouth shut and letting her talk that whole town into silence herself. She'd already won before we ever reached the wagon." And in the end, long after Silas Ashworth's name had faded from memory, and even the last of the old townsfolk who'd laughed that first day had passed on themselves, the story that remained carried a single unshakable truth at its heart: that real love was never about finding someone who overlooked your size, your loudness, your unwillingness to shrink yourself for anyone's comfort. Real love was about finding the one person strong enough to stand beside all of it undiminished, and building together a home that no amount of cruelty, doubt, or scheming could ever tear back down. That was the truth. Bitterroot Gulch carried forward, long after the last of the old feuds and old fears had faded into simple, well-worn story, that a mountain once known for breaking brides had become known instead for the one who refused to break and who taught an entire valley, one hard season at a time, exactly what that kind of refusal could build. That was the legacy Abigail Harper left behind. Not the woman who'd survived a mountain's mockery. The woman who had proven beyond any doubt that she had never needed surviving at all, only the chance finally to be seen, to be believed, and to be loved exactly as she was.